Welcome to NOAA Live Alaska. My name is Story Oates, and I'm going to be moderating today's webinar. This is a collaborative effort by NOAA Fisheries Alaska Fisheries Science Center, where I work, NOAA's Alaska Regional Collaboration Network, and NOAA's National Weather Service. I also want to introduce my co-coordinators, Lisa Hiruki-Raring, who's off camera right now, and Mabel Baldwin-Schaefer, who will be helping me behind the scenes. This webinar series is designed to help you get to know NOAA's work in Alaska, our partners and the communities we work with, and how we connect with your community. NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, studies the ocean and the atmosphere and where the two meet, from weather to oceans to the animals that live around us. This school year, we are presenting monthly webinars that feature our partnerships with organizations across Alaska. We're aiming to present perspectives from the communities we work with, as well as research conducted by established scientists and students. Today, we are introducing you to Jordan Hollersmith, Alaska Fisheries Science Center's Mariculture Program Lead, Alicia Bishop, Alaska Regional Office's Aquaculture Coordinator, Juliana Cornett, an Alaska Sea Grant Fellow at the Alaska Fisheries Science Center, and Jamie Curry, an Alaska Sea Grant Fellow at the Alaska Regional Office. While we'll be talking about NOAA's and our partners' roles in research and stewardship, we want to recognize that we are all coming to you from the traditional lands of Indigenous communities that have substantial traditional and local knowledge and much to share with us. We acknowledge that the NOAA scientists and fellows you will hear from today work in and around the coastal waters of Alaska. The project they will be speaking about occurred on and around traditional homelands and waters of the Tlingit people, specifically the Chilkat and Chilkoot tribes of Southeast Alaska, who have stewarded their lands and water since time immemorial. We are indebted to their wisdom, knowledge of their lands and waters. We are presenting this webinar from Juneau, Alaska, the ancestral homelands of the Akwaan and Takuquan Tlingit people. The community thrives thanks to their continued sharing of vision, wisdom, values, and leadership. Lisa is joining from Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, which is Treaty 6 territory and home to many diverse Indigenous peoples whose ancestors' footsteps have marked this territory for centuries. And Mabel is calling from Benta, or Wasilla, Alaska, the traditional homelands of the Dena'ina and Ahtna peoples who have stewarded this land for thousands of years. A few guidelines before I hand you over to our speakers. You are all muted because we have a lot of people on the line and want to make sure everyone can hear our speakers. However, there is a box where you can write questions. We encourage you to ask them as we go, and my colleagues Lisa, Mabel, and I will be keeping track of our speakers. We'll stop every now and then and answer a few questions. We may not get to all of our questions, but we'll try to answer as many as we can. Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Jordan and Alicia to introduce themselves.
Hi, everyone. You can go to the next slide, Story. Nice to meet you all. My name is Jordan Hollersmith. I'm talking to you from the Alaska Fisheries Science Center here in Juneau, Alaska, and I'm the Mariculture and Macroalgae Lead Research Biologist here in Juneau. But I got my start, I grew up in San Francisco, California, and one of my first jobs in science, here's a picture of me doing it, was sucking up ants with a little tube called a pooter in order to look at their genetic structure. Next slide. But I soon realized I loved the ocean and wanted to spend more time in it. So I had the opportunity to travel all around the world, working for different jobs within science, a lot of which were in coral reefs, trying to rebuild them, understand how climate change would impact them. Next slide. But after all that wandering, I now have the amazing privilege and opportunity to live in Juneau, Alaska with my family. And today we're going to tell you a little bit more about what my job entails. Thanks.
Hey everybody, my name is Alicia Bishop and I'm the Regional Aquaculture Coordinator for NOAA Fisheries in Alaska. But before I moved to Alaska, I grew up in the landlocked state of Arkansas. Some of you guys might not even know where Arkansas is, so I've highlighted it here in red. And growing up in Arkansas, I always had a love of science and animals. And one of the first animals I got to study was the awesome chicken. and looking at nutrition, like how to make them grow faster, how to make them grow bigger, and genetics. And that led me to taking my next internship and my first trip to Alaska at the Sea Life Center in Seward. And I got to study stellar sea lions and diving ecology. And this just blew my mind and really excited me about marine biology, and ultimately led to my path in working for the National Marine Fisheries Service. And through that, I have got to work all across the country on the East Coast and the West Coast, and have got to do some really cool projects like aerial surveys for marine mammals in a helicopter. I've also got to do large whale necropsies. And for those of you guys who don't know what necropsies are, that's cutting up a dead animal, and in this case, trying to figure out why they died. So it's super exciting, super stinky, but really cool. And then most recently, next slide, I've got to work in aquaculture, and it's been really exciting to learn about new species and habitats, getting to learn about shellfish and seaweeds, and getting to work with our science center on all of that. Next slide. But one of the things that really excites me is getting to share my love of science with kids and classrooms just like you guys. So our Harborview kids, you might recognize some of your classmates on here. We've had the enjoyment of getting to work with kids in aquaculture, and today we're going to walk you through some of that most recent work. Next slide. So with this, I'm going to turn it over to you. You heard about how Jordan and I have got to work in aquaculture, but I'd like to ask you, have you heard of mariculture or aquaculture, and what is it?
All right, thanks for that, Alicia and Jordan. So for those of you, you can type your answers into that question box. So have you ever heard of mariculture or aquaculture? Do you know what it is? So you can type in your best guess. We've got some folks coming in saying, no, I've never heard of it. There's a lot of no's. We have Anne saying farming fresh or salt water. Another not heard of it. Growing things in the ocean.
Yeah. Those are all really great answers. And mariculture and aquaculture can kind of be used in the same way. But yeah, it's basically, we can grow things in the ocean, like you said. Aquaculture can also be in river systems and non-marine systems. And mariculture just means in the marine environment. So great answers, everybody. So our next question for you is, why is mariculture important in Alaska?
All right, so we have a lot of folks coming in saying, you know, again, fish and seaweed farming. Actually, Miss Curry's class says aquaculture sounds like a superhero. Harvesting water plants. So with all of these answers, why might that be important for Alaska? How might farming different animals or seaweeds help out Alaska? We've got someone saying not sure. Foods.
Yeah.
And other guesses. Growing food to provide habitat for marine animals. Local food source. It's too cold to farm above ground year round, so moving it to the ocean. Source of income, we live near the water, provides more food. We depend on things in the ocean. Sounds like there's some really good reasons why we might have mariculture in Alaska.
Yeah, all great answers, everybody. If we move to the next slide, we're going to highlight why NOAA Fisheries is involved in aquaculture and mariculture. We are a really big agency, but if you think about it, we're kind of divided in these three main themes. So we have research, like the really awesome science that folks like Jordan are doing at our science centers, and they're looking at all sorts of different things that are raised from both our managers and their needs, and industry and their needs. So looking at how do we grow new critters like abalone? How do farms and things potentially interact with the environment? Like in this case, there's a slide on herring eggs on kelp farms, or like where are our existing habitats located? So how to map those things out. And then you take all that really cool science and research and you apply it. And that's where the work that I do comes in at the regional office. So that's kind of your policy and management arm. And so we take that cool research and we think about, if we're going to move aquaculture forward, how do we do that in like a sustainable and safe way? How do we apply mitigation measures to make sure that our marine mammals aren't impacted or our habitats aren't impacted? You know, how do we consider all of those things as we're kind of moving forward with this new industry? So with that, we can kind of move forward and let Jordan dive into some of our more recent work. Thanks.
So this was a really fun project that we did because, as Alicia mentioned, and as you all mentioned, a lot of mariculture involves seaweed, and a lot of it in Alaska right now is kelp, but there are other seaweed that are really, really important for the people in the state. And one of those is a seaweed known as dulse or kach in Tlingit. Red ribbon algae is another word for it. Devillaria mollis is the Latin names. You can see any species can have so many different names depending on who you are, where you come from, what you're interested in, what your perspective is. And this seaweed grows, you can see some pictures of it here. It's a red seaweed, grows on the shoreline all the way from California, where I grew up, out to the Aleutian Islands. So huge, huge range. And people have been eating this seaweed since time immemorial. It is really good nutrition. It's like delicious vegetables from the ocean. And so if we go to the next slide, since this is such an important seaweed for the people in Alaska, the Klukwan School in Klukwan near Haines in Southeast Alaska, a teacher there reached out to us about working with her in her classroom so we could all learn more about this traditionally important seaweed, including how to grow it in her classroom. So mariculture can be big kelp farms, big oyster farms in the ocean, but it can also be something so small as growing a seaweed that you know and love in your classroom so that you can learn about it better. And so we went to schools in Klukwan and Harborview Elementary in Juneau and worked with the students there, and you guys are gonna get to do some of the activities that we did with the students with Juliana in a minute, and you're going to learn more about how we figured out how to grow this important seaweed in the classroom with Jamie. So with that, we'll bring it to them. Next slide. Oh, excuse me, briefly. So that is the thing that we built to be able to grow it in the classroom. And Jamie is going to show you a much smaller version of it that we've built here. Because the kids in Klukwan are still using that one to grow the algae and grow other things. All right, next slide.
All right, so I think we're gonna pause here for some questions. So does anyone have any questions for Jordan and Alicia about aquaculture or mariculture or any of the things that you saw here on the screen? I wanna go back because oh, I'm sorry. We had a question way back at the very beginning.
Miss Royal's class.
Yes, or Miss Royal's class.
The ATCA students wanted to know, how do you tell the difference between male and female seaweeds?
Male and female seaweed? Oh, so that was one of the things that we went over with the classes, is how seaweed reproduce. And we're not going to do that activity today, but very briefly, the male and the seaweed that you see that's really big, it's not male or female. It's both. It creates spores. But then those spores settle into teeny, teeny, tiny, microscopic male and female algae that you need a microscope to see. They're so small. So if you went out into the ocean, you wouldn't see the male and female. They're too small. But then those, they reproduce, the gametes come together and grow up to be the big plant that you see again. That's not a male or a female or both. It's its own thing. Algae is different than animals in a lot of ways, and plants, and we're going to learn about that later today too. Cool question though.
All right, we have another question from Miss Bradley's class. How does seaweed grow?
Oh, see, you guys are all preempting us with these questions. Jamie is going to go over what seaweed needs to grow, because we had to think about all those things in order to grow it in the classroom instead of in the ocean. You have to think about all the different things that allow seaweed to grow and bring those things into the classroom. So he will tell us all about it in a minute.
Fantastic. We have another question from Matthew. He's curious, how tall can seaweed get?
Oh, that's a fun question. So some of the species like kelp, they can get 80 feet tall. Can you even picture 80 feet? How many stories is that of a building? That's a lot of stories. But and then seaweed can also be really small. And the dulse that we were working with, those are usually around the size of your hand, maybe a little bit bigger. So there's a wide range, similar to plants. Some trees are super, super tall, whereas some little flowers are really small. Same with seaweed.
Okay, Miss Curry's class was wondering about seaweeds and how many seaweed species are in Alaska?
Oh, I don't know. We might all have to look on
Peter Sheed had around 200 species that, there was like an estimate.
Nice. But sometimes NOAA researchers or anyone finds new species too that we didn't know about before. So that number is always changing.
We've got a couple of classes that are asking, what animals eat seaweed besides humans?
Oh, you guys are so good with this. Juliana is going to tell us in a minute about some of those species and is going to show you one.
All right, this is exciting. All right, another question here. What plants are related to dulse?
So that's another thing we might go over today, but plants and algae and seaweed, they might look the same, but they are actually completely different lineages of evolution, if you will. So they're really, really different, even if they look similar.
So a follow-up to that, are there other seaweeds that are similar to dulse?
Yes, so if you go to the shoreline and you see seaweeds that look red, just in general, the red seaweeds, they all have similar colors and they're all more related to each other.
Okay, and we have one more question about seaweed growth. How small is it when it starts growing?
Remember when I said that the male and females are microscopic? So when it starts growing, it's so, so small that you need a powerful microscope in order to even see it at all.
All right, I think we're going to take one more question before moving on, and this might be a really good segue for Juliana and Jamie. Does seaweed attach and grow on animals?
Oh, yes, we are going to be able to show you an example that sometimes it does. But they prefer to be on rocks and things that don't move.
And in our earlier picture, we also showed you where animals sometimes attach and grow on seaweeds too.
All right, so we still have a couple of questions, but we'll come back to those. I want to make sure that we have time for the show and tell. So with that, we are going to have Juliana and Jamie show us around a little bit.
Hi everyone, my name is Juliana Cornett and I'm originally from California. I grew up on the central coast of California, really close to the ocean, so I spent a lot of time at the beach and the aquarium, and this helped me develop interest in learning about the ocean and learning about science and plants and animals really early on. And then I went to the University of California, Davis, where I studied biology, and I also got the chance to study sea anemones. So I was looking at their genetics and also how the really tiny algae that live inside some species of sea anemone work. And then I went to Moss Landing Marine Laboratories to get my master's degree, and I studied flatfish there and how they respond to low levels of oxygen. And then after that, I moved up to Juneau, Alaska about 3 months ago now, and I'm currently an Alaska Sea Grant Fellow at the NOAA Alaska Fisheries Science Center. And here I do mariculture research, and I've had some really exciting opportunities so far, and all of those photos that you see there are doing field work out at a local oyster farm, which is one of the projects that I'm involved in.
All right, and hello everyone. I'm Jamie, and I grew up in Maine. And you can kind of see I always had sort of an interest in animals and plants and life. So you can see there's a picture of me there working on a beehive in my parents' backyard. And I knew that I was very interested in. I knew I was interested in science, but I also had sort of an interest in filmmaking. And when I went to college in Ohio, I couldn't decide whether I wanted to study science or the arts. And so, being an indecisive person, I ended up deciding to do both. So I was a film and biology double major in college. So I was making documentary films. And then I was also working in a wetland ecology lab studying freshwater ecosystems. Next slide, please. And so then after that, I went and worked for the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science as a science communicator. And I basically took my film and biology background and started doing more in the way of like scientific documentary work. And that eventually led me to kind of realizing that I wanted to get back into science, but I was interested in, I missed working in the water. I missed, but I also realized that I wanted to learn more about the ocean. I've become fascinated with it over my years as a science communicator. So I moved to Alaska and did a master's degree in marine biology at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And that job was particularly fun because it let me do a lot of scuba diving, which was excellent in Alaskan waters. Very cold, but excellent. So you can see a picture of me doing some of the diving there. And then I've also been able, while I've been in Alaska, to continue pursuing my film interests. So I do documentaries. That's me making a documentary about Arctic ground squirrels, and then doing all the other stuff that makes Alaska special. So
hi, I'm making 3 boxes here for a John Cooper. Again, John Cooper, Sam's talking about in the lobby. Thank you.
Sorry, technical introduction. That's the peril of doing everything live. So anyway, yes, the things that make Alaska special, like hiking and running and climbing and all the great stuff outside. Next slide, please. All right, so first we can just cover any questions that you guys might have about us in general, but then we're gonna delve directly into showing you guys some seaweed. So I'm just gonna press the button here. Not press the button, I'm gonna plug it in. All right, and so one thing that we wanted to show you all today was a tumble culture. So this is one of our sort of smaller tumble culture setups that we have, we just made very specially for this presentation. And so, taking a look at it, this is the sort of setup that we would bring into a classroom to grow seaweed. So if you guys look at this, what do you notice about it? What do you see in here?
All right, everyone. So I know there's a few folks that are seeing, so the black screen, I've stopped sharing the screen. So all you're seeing right now is the cameras. So yes, so we have bubbles, a water pump, very bubbly, very foamy.
Yes, and those are all true. And that's exactly the point, because the way a tumble culture works is it basically creates a lot of kinetic motion by pumping bubbles into it. And that is able to move the seaweed around a lot. And that's important because, so if you were to think of the tumble culture as like a clothes dryer for a second, if you have a bunch of soaking clothes, how do you dry them? You don't just leave them in a pile on the floor, right? No, you stick them in the tumble dryer, and the tumble dryer injects a bunch of air and tumbles them around and gives them lots of motion and dries them out really quickly. And a tumble culture works the same way, where it tumbles the seaweed around, and because it tumbles the seaweed around, the seaweed is able to absorb a lot more nutrients from the water. It has equal access to light, and it's able to absorb a lot more air. And that means it's able to grow a lot faster. And so this is a really great way of actually growing seaweed in a classroom environment. And it's also very similar to some commercial setups that actually grow, that for some commercial aquaculture setups that actually grow seaweed for, you know, industrial purposes. So this is actually a tool that you all can use in your classroom if you decide you want to grow seaweed. And some of the people joining us today have already tried this, so we know it works. So I think we can put this down now, Juliana. So we already know about how important seaweed is from the standpoint of, you know, it is a great food source for people. But another question is, you know, how important is seaweed to other plants and animals in the ocean, or to plants and animals in the ocean? And so we wanted to delve into with you is the importance of seaweed in marine environments. So can anyone tell me, has anyone seen seaweed in the wild? And if so, have you ever observed animals sort of around it or on it, or just sort of being near or within the seaweed? Has anyone seen animals around seaweed before?
All right, so if you can type into the chat, what animals have you seen around seaweed? We have, yes, we've seen fish around seaweed, hermit crabs, starfish, there's another hermit crab, sea otters, sea urchins.
That's great.
Humans,
Yeah, you guys are doing this.
barnacles, seagulls, whales.
And that's fantastic. And that's exactly the point, because seaweed is sort of a foundational organism that produces an environment that so many other organisms are reliant on. So organisms live amongst the seaweed and they use it for shelter. And they burrow into the holdfasts, which are kind of like the root systems. And they use that as sort of a place to live. And they'll eat the blades. And so seaweed is tremendously important to a gigantic number of animals that live in the ocean. And one type of animal that I wasn't sure if people would think of today or not are snails. But I think everybody has seen snails at some point, and many of you probably have seen them kind of suckered onto seaweed. And the thing about snails is they, like many other organisms, somebody else mentioned sea urchins, snails really enjoy eating seaweed, like a lot of other organisms. And so what we have here is a good example. So, Juliana, what do we have here?
So right here, we have a very special type of marine snail. Does anyone know what this is? Have you ever seen one of these before?
Ooh, so it looks like it's on a rock?
Yes, it's on a
Is that
rock.
right, Juliana? Okay, any guesses?
The snail here.
So a type of snail. We have moon snail, chitin, gumboot. These are all great guesses. These are all types of snails.
Yeah, those are all really good guesses. Any other guesses?
Oh, we have someone made a guess of abalone.
That's it. Yes, this is an abalone. This is a pinto abalone. You can see it there, looking at you all. So just like all other snails, they have this shell, and then they also have this muscular foot. So this is called its foot here. And as Jamie mentioned, this abalone eats seaweed. And the way that it does that is it's actually able to hold on to pieces of seaweed with its muscular foot here. And then it has a feeding structure called a radula, which is basically like a really spiny tongue, and they're able to scrape up the algae that way. But as Jordan mentioned earlier, seaweed can or other types of algae can also sometimes live on different animals. So you can see that this abalone actually has a little bit of green seaweed here growing on its shell, and a little bit of red seaweed growing on its shell back here. So just like these animals need seaweed, sometimes the seaweed will also use the animals as a place to grow.
sent him that in his tank. And so, yeah, seaweeds basically form this great environment for a variety of organisms to live in and to grow on. And we thought we might actually show you really quickly what that might look like in the wild. So if you'll join us on, let me mute this really quickly.
Okay, so we're going to take you on a quick tour here.
We're good?
So you probably saw these aquariums back behind us, but then we also have a bigger one here. So a lot of you mentioned earlier that fish live near seaweed, and you can see that we have quite a few different fish here in the tank. There are also some sea stars there. And some of you also mentioned earlier that urchins like to eat seaweed. And we have a couple big urchins back there in the corner.
Yeah, and so what you guys might notice is that these big kelp fronds here, which are a type of seaweed, they've got many different parts to them. So like a collection of kelp is called a forest, a kelp forest. And in many ways, collections of seaweed are very like a forest. You know, they've got different parts of the organism. Like, so a forest, for instance, has trees in it, and the trees create different environments at various levels. So, you know, there might be animals that live amongst the roots and in the soil. Then there are burrowing animals that live in the bark. And then there's, you know, birds and squirrels and a variety of more arboreal species that live actually up in the branches and amongst the leaves. And in the same way, each different part of a piece of kelp can form a habitat or a food source for animals. So you can kind of make out down here, we've got this sort of tangled root system, which is called the holdfast. And you know, that creates a great three-dimensional environment for smaller animals like hermit crabs and other invertebrates to live in. Oh, yeah, actually, that's great. Perfect. Thank you. Excellent. Another prop. All right. So we've got this, actually, if you can bring that a little closer. Thank you. So we've got this sort of tangled root system down here that animals can live in. And then we've got sort of the stipe and then the blade up here. And then a lot of organisms can live on and also feed on the blade. So it's all completely edible, and it forms a great habitat for a variety of organisms. But trees, you know, forests are predominantly made of trees, and trees are plants. And so one thing that we wanted to delve into is whether or not seaweeds are plants. And we kind of touched on that earlier. So does anyone remember, are seaweeds plants? Or does anyone have any guesses?
Okay, any guesses? You can throw them in the chat there. So are seaweeds the same as plants? Remember what Jordan said earlier. We've got a whole bunch of
Does anyone has
no's.
any thoughts, or everyone remembers?
We have a whole bunch of no's. No, they are different. All right, well done, everyone. So we do have some questions. How are they different?
How are they different? That's an excellent question. So if we actually go into the slideshow, this would also be a good place to kind of go back into it to kind of display it. But so yeah, Story, if we could actually go back into the slideshow, that would be great.
Okay.
Okay, so we've done that.
Okay. So do we want to go? Well,
I suppose we could take questions. Yeah.
so we can go back to that. So here we go. Here's our difference between seaweed and plant.
All right. So it's certainly like a plant. Many people kind of think that seaweeds are plant-like. That's, I believe, one of the technical definitions that I've stumbled across. And so you might be able to see they've got a lot of similarities with plants. So can anyone just take a look at the diagram? We've got a seaweed here and a plant. And can you tell me what are some of the similarities that you observe?
All right, so we have Miss Curry's class saying seaweed doesn't have leaves.
Doesn't have leaves. That's kind of true. It's got one gigantic blade. Doesn't have a lot of different leaves like a plant might. Some species do.
So we've
Not-
got, we also have some root-like bottoms. So the root, so we have our root is like the holdfast. So the holdfast and roots, we're saying are similar. The stipe is like a stem. That's from Ms. Beckett's class. The blade looks like a leaf. It looks like they have roots with the holdfast. One of the big differences here from Ms. Curry's class, seaweed have stipes, plants have stems.
Yeah, that's a big one. So you guys are really getting into some of the similarities and differences right there. It's structured. Someone mentioned the holdfast is like a root system, and some seaweeds don't. This one doesn't have many sort of leaf-like blades. Other seaweeds do. But they look a bit like plants. They've got that root structure, and then they've got this more leaf-like part. And seaweeds photosynthesize like plants do, so they make their energy from the sunlight. But one thing about seaweeds that differentiates them from plants is the amount of differentiation that they have. So if you were to take a chunk of this seaweed, you could put it into, say, a tumble culture, and it would be able to absorb the nutrients and sunlight that it needs in order to continue to survive and grow. If you tear a piece of a leaf off a plant, it won't turn into another plant. But seaweeds can do that. And that's because any part of the seaweed is able to kind of grow and thrive by itself. Another difference is that seaweeds don't have as much in the way of separation in terms of the cell types. So you might think that a holdfast is like a root structure, but the whole point of the holdfast is just to anchor the seaweed to the bottom and prevent it from drifting away. It doesn't actually, what roots do is they not only do they anchor the plant, but they also absorb nutrients out of the soil. Seaweeds don't need to do that because they can absorb nutrients directly into the blade just by wafting around in the water column. So they're able to kind of do it all themselves. Another difference, which Jordan briefly got into, and we won't really touch on very much in this presentation, is in their life cycle. So they are also very different genetically and in the way they reproduce from plants.
All right, I want to make sure that we have time for questions. There's a lot of questions coming in here, Juliana and Jamie. So I'm just gonna back up here. No, just kidding. To our questions. So we have some questions about photosynthesis. So is it true that algae and seaweeds also photosynthesize like plants?
Yes, that is very true. That is very true. And so, if you were to think about the tank that we just saw them in, or take a look at the seaweed here, it kind of is designed in a way so that it's anchored to the bottom, but then this blade reaches towards the sun and can waft in the water column and actually catch the rays of sunlight as they beam through the water. So if you were to take a look at the tank back there, you might notice the tank was very clear. And that's another thing that seaweeds require is clear water. Because if it's really murky, not a lot of sunlight gets through, it gets dark very quickly, they can't generate their own energy. But, if the water is clear, they can reach these blades up towards the surface and photosynthesize and generate their energy, which helps them to grow.
Fantastic. So along the growth questions, we have a couple questions. So one is, why do seaweeds grow on things that don't move? And then along those lines, how long will seaweeds stay on a shell? If it's like on that abalone, will it stay there forever? Why does it not want to move? And in some cases, why is it on an animal that does move around?
Yeah, Well, seaweed, we'll start why it usually doesn't want to anchor on animals that move. And the reason why is because animals have a mind of their own. And they don't necessarily choose to always be in environments where seaweed can thrive. So say a seaweed starts growing on this abalone here, and then the abalone decides, you know what I really want to see? I really want to see the deep sea, where there is no light. And so any seaweed that grows on the abalone is not going to do terribly well as this abalone slowly trundles into darker and darker water, where the seaweed is going to do less and less well. And so seaweed usually, ideally, the seaweed that survives usually has chosen, you know, a really solid place to put its holdfast down. So like jumbles of rocks and cobbles on the bottom are an excellent example. But you know, those little spores won't necessarily aren't the most choosy. So sometimes they will settle on something slow moving like an abalone and then say, hey, this is kind of okay. And you know, life is good for now. It's bright. The abalone's in shallow water. I can grow. And so it does grow. Will it necessarily grow to be an 80-foot long seaweed? Probably not, because at some point, you know, that 80-foot long kelp frond is going to start acting like a sail, and the poor abalone is going to be stuck to a rock, desperately trying to hold on while, you know, this massive seaweed is blowing around in the water column above it. Can animals clean themselves, or can animals avoid having seaweed land on them, and can they clean themselves off? I believe they can, but I'm not totally sure. Juliana, would you care to comment on that? Or on anything else I've said?
I think it just depends on the species. Yeah, something like an abalone, I don't think that they have any mechanism to get that algae off, but some other species would.
Mhm.
All right, so we have a lot of questions about seaweed growth. So so this might be just kind of, I'll ask these all together. So one, how big can a kelp forest get? And how long does it take for seaweed to grow 80 feet? And also in that sense, how long can seaweed live for?
Sorry, yeah, I feel like Jordan should step into this because she can give more specifics, but
We have a seaweed expert.
we have a seaweed expert.
I love these questions. Okay, the first one, how big can a kelp forest get? There is a wide range. Some kelp forests, like in places like California, where you get lots of rocky bottom, that just like Jamie was saying, they're kind of shallow, the water's clear. You can get kelp forests that are miles long, that are really big and dense. Here in Alaska, a lot of what we have are volcanic islands in the Aleutians or fjords here in Southeast Alaska. So the water gets deep really fast. So we know kelp needs light to grow. So the kelp forests here are generally pretty small and close to the shore because that's where it's deep enough for them to get plenty of water, but not so deep that now they have no more light to grow. So that was one of them. How long does it take seaweed to get to 80 feet? That was another one, I think. So only some species get that big. And those would be a few of the kelp species. And they can get that big in a few months. They are some of the fastest growing things that live on the earth. Because a lot of these seaweed species, they only live for 1 year. So that means in that 1 year, they need to go from microscopic, itty bitty tiny, to all the way as big as they're going to get. And they need to reproduce again to make sure that next year there's more seaweed. So a lot of them are 1 year. Some live for a few years. And then some seaweed species can live for 10 years or more. And just like we can look at rings in a tree to understand how old the tree is and what kind of environment it's been exposed to, there are a few kelp species that also make those rings. So you can count the rings and see how old it is and understand a little bit more about what the water was like in those 10 years or so that it was growing. Were there a few other questions in that list?
So I think you hit all of those. So now let's look at like the cellular levels. We kind of looked at the big broad picture of them growing. there's a lot of questions about, first of all, we know that seaweeds aren't plants, but what are they? Are they protists? What are seaweeds?
Yeah, so when you get to, the question is, I think, what kingdom are seaweeds in? So they're not animals, the Animaliae. They're not plants, Plantae. So the protist, that kingdom is kind of everything else that doesn't fit into those other two kingdoms goes in this last one. So depending on who you ask, specifically which taxonomist you ask, so taxonomists, they're the ones that study how organisms are related to each other in this kind of tree of life and evolution. Depending on which taxonomist you ask, they might call the seaweed kingdom different things. But they're, you know, in the same kingdom, if you put it that way, as things like fungus, like mushrooms and stuff, or other bacteria or seaweed. It's a kingdom that includes a lot of different things. I don't know if anyone else
Great,
wants
thank you so much for that answer. Another question we have here is, do seaweeds have chloroplasts like plants? Or are the photosynthetic pigments just distributed in the cells? And on top of that, how many cells does seaweed have? Are they single-celled or multicellular?
Ooh. Yeah, some are single-celled. And Juliana studies a lot of those because things like oysters eat them. And so single-celled seaweeds are really, they're also known as phytoplankton, are really important for mariculture for shellfish and clams and all sorts of other things that filter feed from the water. And then the bigger seaweeds, they do have chloroplasts, but then they also have other photosynthetic pigments, which is why you get different colors, why some are brown and some are red and some are green. The different photosynthetic cells that they have absorb different spectrums of light. And plants have that too. That's why as plants start to die and fall, the leaves, or not die, but lose their leaves and fall, they turn different colors because now we're getting to see what some of those other cells that contribute to photosynthesis, kind of what ranges of light they target.
All right, and that also answered, I think, Miss Bradley's class on what causes the coloration. So we have red, green, and brown seaweeds or kelp. Another question we have here are urchins still a threat to seaweeds by taking over kelp forests?
Ooh. I mean, I would say yes. For the most, in some places, what it really is dependent on is the rest of the ecosystem around and whether there are any controls in place to keep the sea urchin populations down. Because ordinarily, sea urchins, for the most part, feed on seaweed that, what would you call it? It's not rack, but it's just sort of blowing around in the bottom. It's sort of the detritus seaweed. It's lost its holdfast. It's just sort of drifting. But then, you know, if natural predators of sea urchins, like for instance sea otters, are removed, suddenly the urchins are able, they consume all of the sort of detritus seaweed that's blowing around, then they can suddenly start nibbling on like seaweed's holdfasts. And once they snap the stem, the stipe really quickly, the whole thing can just blow away. So as long as sea urchin populations are kept under control, seaweed can thrive.
And only some urchin species will make those kind of barrens that you may have heard of, where it looks like it's just urchins everywhere. So purple urchins are really well known for doing that kind of thing, and a few other species too. But some urchins, they won't have those huge population booms. They just go along and they eat the seaweed that they find. And if they don't find anything, they can kind of hunker down. And urchins can even, if they're starving, if there's no kelp for them to eat, they can shrink. So just how big an urchin is doesn't tell you how old it is, because it can shrink if it gets too hungry. And it can also filter feed from the water column, eating those single-celled phytoplankton seaweed species. So urchins, they're really incredible animals.
They are that.
Okay, and so I've got a couple more questions, and then I want to make sure we have time to do our last activity. But there's been a lot of questions about eating seaweed. So are all seaweeds edible? So could you eat any seaweed that you find?
No, I would not recommend it. Some just won't taste good. Others, like in California, it's known as acid kelp. It's got a lot of, I can't remember which type of acid, but it would make your stomach really hurt. So if you are on the shore and you want to eat some seaweed, make sure you ask an adult, ask someone in your community who knows, and really use this as a chance to learn about which ones are good to eat, really good for you, and which might make your stomach hurt or just taste really bad.
All right, and one more question, the tumble culture keeps coming up. So people are curious, in the wild, do waves tumble the seaweed around like the pump? And also in the classroom, did the class use salt water?
Yeah, both really good questions. And Jordan and Juliana, feel free to chime in on this as well. But yes, in sort of in the ocean, the waves do tumble the seaweed around, and that's sort of the motion of the water is what allows them to sort of recharge and continue to absorb nutrients, and instead of just like, you know, sitting in one still sort of stagnant pool and slowly where all the nutrients would slowly be stripped out. So actually the wave action is very important to the survival and health of seaweeds. And that's part of the reason why the tumble culture works so well. What was the second question? Yeah.
So the other question was about if they used salt water in the classroom for the tumble culture. And they actually did a little experiment with their tumble culture where they had one bucket that had natural seawater from the ocean. And then they had another bucket that had basically artificial salt water. So they took something called Instant Ocean that you can actually get at the pet store, and they added that to regular water and made their own salt water. So what happened in that classroom is they actually had a power outage at one point. So the tumble culture was not tumbling and continuing to go. And what happened is the natural seawater actually had bacteria and other things that made that seaweed decompose. But then the seawater that was in the cleaner Instant Ocean fake seawater actually survived the power outage. So they did a little experiment there to see how the tumble culture would work with using those different types of salt water.
Wow, that's really interesting. All right, so I want to be mindful of time. We've got a lot of questions, but I also want to make sure folks get a chance to see, actually do your seaweed anatomy quiz. So I know this was one of the activity sheets that was pulled together for Claquan School. So, and I know that Jamie and Juliana talked a little bit about this already. So if we can have some guesses here, on the slide we have pointing, what is this part that Juliana is holding up? And we have on the screen. Oh, we already have a whole bunch of guesses coming in. I'm gonna give everyone another 10 seconds so we don't give it away. But it looks like our consensus is hold fast.
Exactly. This is the hold fast. It looks like the roots on a plant, but it doesn't bring up any nutrients or transport nutrients through the plant. All it does is anchor that seaweed down onto a rock or something like that.
Okay, our next one. What is that kind of, I'm not going to say it because I might give it away. What is that part that kind of looks like a stem? Oh, everyone's on this. We've got all the answers are coming in. It is a stipe.
Exactly. This is the stipe. It provides some structure for that seaweed and attaches the hold fast to this other part that we'll ask you what it is next.
Okay, so what is that part that Juliana's holding up and that you see in the diagram? Oh, you all are great listeners. Our general consensus is a blade.
Exactly. This is the blade, and some seaweed has just one big blade. Other seaweed, like the dulse and bull kelp that you see on your screen, that has lots of blades, and that's a surface where that seaweed can absorb sunlight and nutrients that it needs to grow.
All right, we've got one more question here on our quiz. What is this part?
So
see-
this is one we didn't cover yet, so we'll see if you know it. So this is just anything above the holdfast. So not including the holdfast. What do we call the stipe plus however many blades that seaweed has?
All right. We've got an answer coming in here. Kelp.
That's a good guess. It's a type of seaweed, so that's what this is. Some fake kelp and then the bull kelp.
So we've got someone else saying that it's kind of like the whole plant. If it was a plant, so similar. So it'd be like the whole, like if you cut a flower, like you had the whole plant, like that would be the whole thing. I don't know, what is it?
So what we call everything up above that holdfast is the thallus or body.
So on these questions, so we did have someone write in thallus, just as you were saying that, fantastic. So what part of the seaweed would you normally eat? Would you eat the blades or the stipe, or on some of them would it be the thallus or that whole part of it? And does anyone eat the holdfast?
That's a good question. So you can eat the blade. You can also eat the stipe on bull kelp, for example. It has this really big stipe that's hollow, and people sometimes actually cut that up and make pickles out of it. But you can eat the blades as well. If you've had seaweed salad, you're probably eating the blades. I don't know if anybody eats the holdfast, not that I know of.
Never heard of any humans eating the holdfast. Other
True,
things.
lots of animals eat the holdfast.
All right, fantastic. So we do have just a couple more minutes here. And again, I've got lots of questions. So another question on eating seaweed. Can you cook it or can you eat it raw or both?
Both. Yeah, depending on the type of seaweed and what you're making. Sometimes you're eating it raw and sometimes you're cooking it.
Okay. Are there any freshwater species of seaweed?
So there aren't any freshwater species of seaweed, but there are freshwater species of algae. So there are some that are closely related.
Fantastic. All right, and we have one other question. I know we talked a lot, and this might depend, but we talked about where seaweeds grow. How deep is the perfect spot for a seaweed or kelp? And I know this would probably depend on the species, but what is that sweet spot?
Yeah, that's a great question. So seaweed is limited on either end. Some of them can live up in the intertidal zone where they're not even going to be in the water the whole time, but they can only go so high that they're still going to be in the water a decent amount of the time. And then the lower limit is set by sunlight. So there's a certain point in the ocean where there's going to be not enough sunlight for that seaweed to grow. So it's sort of trapped somewhere in that zone of where it has enough water and enough sunlight.
Okay, and another question on growth. So how long does it take to regrow? So if you like with the tumble culture, you're taking your pieces and you're shredding them up. How long does it take for a piece that's been shredded to kind of regrow to the same size or bigger?
That's a really good question. I'm not 100% sure. Jordan, do you have any idea?
They do grow quickly.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's going to be something that the students in Club 1 are looking at, but it also depends which species. So it's not like maybe sea star where if you cut off one leg, it grows back to a whole star. If you took just one part of the blade of some kelp, it wouldn't grow back to a whole kelp. But the blade itself may be able to keep growing and survive. It would be able to keep surviving. So what we wanted to do with the Club 1 classroom is we ripped them up, and some parts of it were just the middle part of the blade. And that part would be able to keep surviving, but it wouldn't grow very much or very fast. But then some parts of it, like the tip of it, that's where, if it was in the wild, that's where it would be growing quickly. So that tip would be able to grow a lot faster. So it depends which part, what species, and then how many nutrients you give it, what kind of light, all those things that it's going to need to grow.
Wow, that sounds, thank you for that. The whole thing sounds so exciting, and there's so many different experiments, it sounds like, that you could do with the classroom, just asking questions just like this and finding out for yourself. So I do want to, we're just now at 2 o'clock, so we're now out of time, but I want to thank all of our viewers for tuning in, and I want to thank all of our presenters. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge about seaweed and just sharing how you've worked with the community and classrooms, so that we can all learn a little bit more about this amazing species. Thank you.
Thank you.
And for all of those that are still on, we will be taking a break for December, but we will be back in January with some more NOAA Live Alaska webinars, so stay tuned. And thank you all again for joining us. Take care.